Welcome to Season 4 of the Hometown Haunts podcast. And we are starting it off strong with a fascinating topic and a wonderful guest. Folklore has a way of capturing the concerns and fears of society it exists within. Authors Leanna Renee Hieber and Andrea Janes focus their new book, A Haunted History of Invisible Women, True Stories of America's Ghosts, on famous, infamous, and lesser-known female ghosts of American history. From Bridget Bishop, the first person executed at the Salem witch trials, to our very own Ma Green haunting the Delta Queen, Heber and Janes explores the role these ghostly legends play within society's memory. Due to tonight's topics, this episode may not be suitable for the youngest of ears, so listener discretion is advised. Hello and welcome everyone to Season 4 of the Hometown Haunts podcast, brought to you by the Cincinnati Cabinet of Curiosities. Welcome, welcome. We have had a busy summer. I am glad you're able to join us. I am Kat Cloco, the host of the Hometown Haunts podcast, and tonight, along with me in the shadows, like every single week, all the time, we have Jen Kohler and Christina Wald. They'll be with me very shortly. So, if you would like to catch up with us, you can check us out on Sin Cabinet Curio on Twitter and Cincy Cabinet of Curiosities on Instagram. And, of course, we're always dying to hear about your personal encounters with the paranormal and fringe history from your neck of the woods. Send it to hometownhauntedmail@gmail.com or join and share it on our Facebook group, Hometown Haunts. We're an official podcast. Thank you, Jen. That can be heard wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you want to see us while we're doing the show, like right now, you can watch the video feed on YouTube. Find us by searching Cincinnati Cabinet of Curiosities, and please rate and review us on all these platforms so you can let other spooky lovers just like yourself know this lovely little slice of the internet exists. And of course, as always, all the links are in the show notes of all the media. All right, so it's been a while, so let's take it with Christina Wald with the show news, because there is a lot of it from your area. Christina, you're a busy lady.
Yes, I have a Kickstarter starting this week. Sketching Here and Everywhere. My sketching obsession launches next week, or this week, I guess.
Yeah.
And it is a book about sketching. I've been working on it for actually a very long time, but it is finally coming to fruition, and it showcases my sketches. It has anecdotes about my experiences sketching, which, as I was doing some last minute editing, I actually added a Roswell story because I was sketching in New Mexico, and I think it was in Albuquerque, and someone actually came up and said that they were related to the people that found the crash in Roswell, and he proceeded to talk about all this stuff for quite a long time while I was sketching about his experiences with the UFO crash in Roswell. So that was kind of interesting. But I have sketch exercises that I've developed working with my students. My husband and I developed this little tiny palette that we're selling with the book that people seem to be really crazy about. I've been an urban sketcher for years, and we always love tiny gear.
Yes.
And so this is like why people like it so much.
It is the tiniest little, what is it, a watercolor or acrylic palette?
It's for watercolors, yes.
Okay.
And so it has a Velcro strap, so you can either wear it on your finger, or it has a little modular clip you can put in it that will clip to your sketchbook. So
it's so small it can go on your finger.
Yeah, it's like it's less than 2 inches. It's like 1 3/8 by 1 1/4 inches. And I think it's like a 1/4 inch deep. And it's just, like when you're sketching certain places like museums, they often don't want you bringing in your huge pile of watercolors and stuff. So this is something super tiny you could have in your pocket and then whip it out to work with your watercolor brush and paint in places that usually you wouldn't be allowed to. Not that we urban sketchers are that rebellious, but we like to have our tools with us at all times. Right. But anyway, so that's launching this week. I'll have an update our next show. And then I also have a one-woman show opening at Columbia Plaza downtown, which is also going to be all sketches. And there's going to be a show opening, but I don't know when that is yet, so I'll have that in the notes. As Leanna mentioned, we have Books by the Banks coming November 19th. And Leanna will be there, our guest, and I will be there with Sloth's Treehouse Inn. And I'm hoping I can get them to carry a couple other books, but they're ones that have just come out. So,
Yeah. So
and the,
for people who don't know what Books by the Banks is, what
uh,
is it?
it is a big Cincinnati book festival. And this is the first year they've had one, I think, since 2019. I think they
Mhm.
canceled it in 2020 and then didn't have one in 2021. And it is a great place to get books of all types. Like they not only have a lot of local authors and illustrators, they bring in some pretty big guns sometimes. Like I remember the woman who wrote Gone Girl was there, and they have John Scalzi's come there a couple times. A lot of really great authors from around the country have come to it. And it's a great place to do your Christmas shopping and buy books for relatives.
Oh, yes. Yes,
They have
yes, yes.
lectures. They've talked about writing. They have actually have a writing competition now too, um, that I believe just happened. I don't know that much about it. I've just been seeing posts about it online.
Okay. Yeah, it is actually at the Duke Energy Center this year as
Yes.
well. So it is going to be massive and fun. So, yay. And then also, I have news from our cryptid walk that we did with the Washington and Circleville Parks District. So, for those of you that are joining us from that wonderful event, hello, welcome. Nice to see you again. That was an event where on opening day, I told ghost stories for 2 hours straight. And um, there was lots of people that came. About 70 we had in attendance for that. Christina was there, and as well as our friend Katie. And also at the very end, I got to tour the Smith House, which has its own ghost stories as well, and they were telling me about that. And the big event was the hide and seek challenge that went through the forest, and it was featuring Steve Stagelin's um, work from issue 2 of the Cincinnati Cabinet of Curiosities, which he worked on one of the Crosswick Snake stories. So he illustrated a giant Bigfoot, a giant frogman, a giant Crosswick snake, and a few other things that were hidden throughout the forest and fields in uh, Big Bill Yuck Park. And it was available for walking through for 2 weeks. And then at the end, you can vote who is your favorite cryptid. And we now have the winner of who is the favorite Ohio cryptid. And it is none other than the Ohio Grassman. The Grassman is the most popular cryptid. And unfortunately, the Crosswick Snake came third to, I think, the Frogman. So, but there was like 9 to 11 of them hidden around the forest. When my partner went through, they only found a few of them, I think 3. So they were really well hidden, but it was popular, and hopefully we'll have this event next year as well. So, great things. All fun. Big over 300 people went through it in total.
Wow.
Yeah. So, tonight, we welcome back to the show and friend of the show, Leanna Hieber, award winning author and paranormal history expert. A regular speaker at sci fi, fantasy, and paranormal conventions, she's appeared on film and television and on shows including Mysteries at the Museum and Beyond the Unknown. She's a 3-time Prism Award winner for her debut novel, The Strangely Beautiful Tale of Miss Percy Parker, and the Daphne du Maurier Award finalist for Darker Still. After earning a BFA in theater performance and focused study in the Victorian era, she spent many years in the professional regional theater circuit, skills that serve her well as a speaker and a ghost tour guide for Boroughs of the Dead in New York City. Yes. Leanna lives in New York, New York, and can be found online at leannareneehieber.com. And of course, that link will be in the show notes. So, welcome back, Leanna. Thank you for your patience with us tonight as we are all silly gals.
Tis the season when those of us who are career spooky people, like we've all been for some time,
Mhm.
this is the month where we're absolutely loopy, and none of us know whether we're coming or going. I've been on book tour, and I don't even know like what I only know now I'm in New York because I'm in my space, but
Mhm.
but it has been I've been doing interviews from hotel rooms and various other things, and so I completely understand. Welcome back to your show.
Yes.
So
Thank
I
you
am,
for having the time to join us again.
of
We've
course,
been
no, I would do
eager about this
anything.
book.
I'm so thrilled, and I was so excited when I last spoke with you to come back to talk about this book. So, and definitely to pay homage to some of my hometown, a hometown ghostly hero for certain, who lived through the time period that I write about in my fiction. So
Yeah.
it was really delightful. I knew going into this book, we weren't entirely sure when we first started exactly who and what we were going to cover, but I knew I was like, I'm going to find a really good Cincinnati ghost.
Yes.
Got to do the hometown proud. So
Yes. I will say every time you're on on this show so far, we've talked about steamboats at some point.
I mean, it is inextricable with Ohio history.
It
So
really
it is one
is.
of those things where, yeah, and I of all sort of travel conveyances, it is kind of my favorite. But I love boats, and
Mhm.
I love writing about and talking about them, and I just think it's a very, very interesting part of the state history too. So yeah, it's just it's a default.
Yes. We got boats of all types. Yeah, boats, canals, and cholera. Those are the thing that Ohio is made of.
And some good beer.
There's
There's
some
some
good
good
beer.
beer brewing history. Like, my
Yeah.
German ancestors brought some nice things, a music hall,
Yes.
beer.
Yes. Oh,
So
yes. Yeah. So, what for our listeners who did not listen to our first podcast, because we have a lot of new ones.
hi, welcome new
Hi,
people.
welcome everyone. What is Boroughs of the Dead?
So Boroughs of the Dead is New York City's top rated, we are proud to say, ghost tour company. So it was founded by Andrea Janes, my co-author
Mhm.
of A Haunted History of Invisible Women, which is ostensibly what we're going to be talking about today. Not exclusively, but for the most part. So A Haunted History of Invisible Women, True Stories of America's Ghosts came out just in time for spooky season. And Andrea and I have worked together now for probably, I think it's been about 8 years. Her and I met when we were both asked to tell a theatrical ghost story for a ghost story event at a bar in New York. And I really liked not only what she had to say about not only her, sort of performance as a storyteller, but I also really liked how she presented her take on ghosts in general and why they're important and why ghost stories are a very necessary part of sort of the human existence, and because they do more than just tell a story,
Mhm.
and I always knew that, and it was nice to see a fellow ghost story enthusiast tie it back into the living,
Mhm.
and that it says as much about us as the living as it does about the stories we tell. So right away there was like sort of an affinity of mission and kind of presentation, and so I had been aware of Birds of the Dead. It's like this, top rated ghost tour company. They did these cool tours of Lower Manhattan, and they were expanding into doing some different tours around the boroughs of New York City. And so I kind of just assumed it was sort of like this empire of a savvy, business plan. It turns out it was just Andrea and her computer, and and she just made it look like there was an army of staff. And so I said after the ghost story reading, I said, if you need another tour guide, ghosts are kind of my thing. It's definitely, ghosts are in every bit of my fiction, and they're my favorite thing to talk about. And I do have a tour guide's license, which
Ooh.
in order to be a tour guide in New York City, you do have to be licensed, and it is a whole process, and you do have to pass a fairly extensive test. Now, this is good because New Yorkers like to talk about things whether they are expert in it or not. And so it is good, in fact, to test said New Yorkers whether or not that's the Empire State Building or the Chrysler Building, because they will convincingly tell you maybe the wrong thing. So the test kind of separates a little bit of like, no, are you serious about this, or do you just want to listen to yourself talk? So which is a very New York trait. So presenting like, hi, would you like to hire me? Amiably to Andrea. And she said, I should probably take on an employee. And I was like, wait, you mean you don't have one? She's like, no. I was like, well, good job for making it seem like you did. And so I was the first hire in the company, and now there are several like a stable of guides who've been with the company for years now, and they're fantastic. And so the way this book ended up happening. So me joining Boroughs of the Dead was the first thing that happened, and this was, it would have been about 8 years ago. And then I've definitely just enjoyed walking around New York, talking about New York's history and making that contemporaneous with a ghost story happening in the present, kind of a present moment, a haunted place that's still an active space, makes this historical place very relevant to a modern moment, because at any moment you could have some sort of echo of the past that might be interacting with you at any point. And I think that's a very exciting place to be, in that space of possibility. And uncanny things have happened to me through some of my tours. And I certainly am drawn to the paranormal because I've had lots of paranormal experiences happen to me. I'm a skeptic first, as is Andrea, and then I'm a believer second. And Andrea is more the Scully to my Mulder, in that, like, still kind of holding on to skepticism almost a little bit more than she might need to. Because sometimes I'm like, yeah, well, that was a thing though, but okay. But again, I don't tell anybody what to think, and she doesn't tell anybody what to think, because that's the whole thing with the paranormal is, as we all know, it's deeply personal. And one person's paranormal experience is never going to mirror somebody else's. It's going to be entirely individual. Different senses are going to be involved, or no senses at all. And so we operate as ghost tour guides, and in our book, we operate from a perspective of everyone is welcome, as long as you're nice. Believers, skeptics, and everybody in between. And we don't tell you what to think, because we're certainly not going to try to answer the divine mystery or the existential questions for you. That's literally not our job. It's way above our pay grade. So, so I'm really thrilled that I was able to kind of return the favor, in terms of, like, Andrea hires me as a ghost tour guide. I'm giving tours. An editor for a publishing house who really liked my tour had mentioned, you should really do a ghost book of ghost stories, knowing that I had a lot of fiction under my belt and had, I've been traditionally published since 2009. And I have had a book out, or one or two books out a year since then. So, but I hadn't done nonfiction yet. However, I was speaking both as a ghost tour guide and just a general New York City tour guide. I'd been speaking about historical facts and in a presentational capacity for a long time. And I had a lot of thoughts about how the framework of how we, the living, talk about the spirit world. So I had plenty of thoughts to put into a nonfiction. I just hadn't been sort of put to the test yet. But when an editor approaches you and says, hey, you should do a thing, this business is hard. You say yes to the thing that the editor approaches you to do, because you would like to stay published and stay employed. So I said, great, let's talk about this. And I said to the editor, I said, I'm only going to be comfortable going forward with this if I can bring my boss into this book. Not because I don't feel like I have my own things to say, but because the angle and the way in which I'm presenting this very respectful and history first, paranormal second presentation comes from the ethos and the mission of Boroughs of the Dead as a company. So that was really important for me to be like, hi, I'm only here because I'm a part of your mission, Andrea, and company. So, and then she was gracious to say, yes, let's do this. And we've had a blast doing it. It's taken some twists and turns, and it's been a wild experience, because all things are and unpredictable in many ways. And the original editor who wanted to do the book ended up not being able to, because something else happened in-house, and it ended up not going forward within that original house. So we had this wonderful proposal package that was ready for my editor at Kensington, who I'd been working with in my fictional ghost stories. So she was ready to look at it, and she loved it, and she took it on pretty much as soon as we had handed her the proposal package. We, being my agent, handed her the proposal package. Thankfully, I'm not good at legalese, so I'm really glad to have an agent navigate all that kind of thing. But so I was approached about in 2018, and so it took several years through the pandemic to get everything finalized with the publication details and then the process of writing it.
Right.
And then just a lot of back and forth about it. And the very brilliant thing was that our editor, Elizabeth May at Kensington, she had the brilliant idea of how to kind of formulate the book, because originally it was just going to be a book of New York ghost stories. And then when Kensington wanted to take it on, they said, we like your approach, but we would like it to be the country. We would like you to touch down in other spaces not outside of New York. And so we said, sure, that's fine. We can do that. We were not given like a certain metric of how many ghosts we had to do from which places. We were not going to do it by geography. Liz was really insistent that we do it by trope and stereotype.
Okay.
Like these, and so that's really, I think, and Andrea and I have been saying on these, when we discussed the book, it really was a stroke of genius for Liz to be like, this is how we organize this. We organize this into trope and stereotype. So by that, I mean groups and categories. And so we have Death and the Maiden, about, the tragedy of women dying young and how that can sometimes be romanticized and very complicated. We have mothers and wives. Obviously, these are roles that women have been expected to play for a long time. We have quote unquote witches. We have quote unquote mad women. And those quotes are very important because the Salem witches were not witches, and very often, quote unquote, mad women were not, in fact, insane.
Right.
So these are things that have been cast as aspersions. We have spinsters and widows, positing the concept of why are we so afraid as a society of women living alone. So, and then we of course have to have a bad girls, Jezebels, and fallen women category. And then there's frauds, fakes, and myth making, because when you start to talk about the paranormal and the history of things like spiritualism, not only is it very rife with fascinating intersections of women's history and even the women's rights movement, but it is also filled with people who were not being forthcoming about where their quote unquote talents were, in fact, complete fraudsters. So we don't escape that, and we want to make sure that we're when we're talking about the history of mediumship, as was put forward by the 19th century spiritualists, that we're calling out the fact that not everybody was doing it for the right reasons, or were being honest about what they were doing.
Right.
They were just magicians dressing it in fashionable clothing. So that's kind of the structure of the book. That's a little bit how it came to be, and we've been very, very blessed by having really interesting discussions about this book, because it really does. We ask a lot of questions. We ask the reader to consider a lot of questions. And so it's been by far some of the most meaty discussions I've ever had in talking about a book. And so we really welcome all of that.
I would say it's because it's a meaty book. So,
Thanks.
Yeah. So reading through this, I will really suggest actually applying this to be purchased by folklore departments at universities.
Thank you.
Because this was like reading some of the conversations I had when I was studying to be a cultural anthropologist. And that's why I have the Haunted Halls book. But yeah, it's a lot of this reading through, I felt I could see the influence that Joseph Campbell had, folklorist Jan Scott Brunvand had, Dr. Brunvand, and Richard Dorson, and a lot of these, their forefathers, unfortunately, because back in the 1950s, we still didn't have a lot of female social scientists. They started coming in the 1960s and 70s, and now they are prevalent within social sciences. But if I read a lot of these, I'm like, yes, this is very much a topic and a lens, as Christina said. This was Christina's words. I'm stealing them. That it was a unique lens to present all of this history with. And Christina, you've been listening to the audiobook. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's really fascinating about it is how you view it anthropologically. Is that a word? Did I say that right? Okay.
Yeah, you can say anthropologically.
Okay. I have a tendency to make up words, so I was not sure.
So do anthropologists.
I think it's fascinating to look at it through this lens, because the reason why I was particularly fascinated by the fact that you talk about mostly women being on these ghost tours is because like any show you see on television, it's all men. Like all these ghost shows, it's a bunch of dudes.
Dude
And
Run is a famous mentioning from Ghost Hunters. Just sorry.
It's
It makes me
true.
laugh still thinking about it. Keep
and
going, Christina.
I almost want to see you all do a show where you're doing investigations and that sort of thing, because it would be so refreshing than a bunch of guys like scaring themselves all the time. And I thought that was really fascinating. And you have a lot of, and I noticed the trope angle that you have, and that was really fascinating as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. It was important to me when I was thinking about my introduction, because Andrea and I both have an introduction into this. I had the good fortune of meeting Katrina Weidman, the one lady on all those paranormal sort of, Ghost
Yeah.
Bro shows.
It was her and Chris Williams, and that was
Right.
it for a very long time.
Right, exactly. And so I had when as soon as this book was going forward, I messaged Katrina and I said, and I'd referenced we had met on a media tour, and she was just the nicest person, and we just had the most lovely conversation about being a woman in the paranormal field. And so I presented, the topic of this book, and I said, I'd love to get your thoughts in our introduction if at all possible. And she did. She gave us some lovely thoughts about needing to kind of hold her own, and also too the fact that this is she's very sensitive to some of the trauma that is associated with the ghosts, which is a very different angle than you have some almost an antagonistic and kind of daring the ghosts and frankly often disrespectful tone that some of the other sort of more jump scare type of shows are going for, in terms of like, that's sort of almost like it feels like it's a Hollywood effect versus people who are going on our ghost tours, at least in Manhattan. When you look at Birds of the Dead's messaging and the way that we talk about ghost stories, if you're looking for a jump scare and someone in a costume, we're not the tour for you. You're going to want to go to an actual like constructed, fabricated haunted house. We are going to tell you history, dark history, difficult history, complicated history. And then we're going to tell you uncanny things that have happened around this site where some of these very unfortunate things took place, or in some cases, sometimes very funny and lighthearted. Not everything is doom and gloom in this book, but like you were noting, Kat, like this is not necessarily a book that is suitable for kids. This is not at all a book meant for kids because we're dealing with very dark history and dark themes. We're dealing with women who are abused, women who are murdered, assaulted, and any number of uncomfortable details that are real historical fact, or there are missing pieces, and it's still an unsolved mystery. So, but a lot of times we're dealing with lots and lots of death surrounding women, and as we know from the statistics of domestic violence and things like that, it's a difficult conversation to be having. And there were moments when both Andrea and I had to walk away from what we were writing. There's only so much I could take about the witch trials and the absolute farcical injustice of them. And you think you sort of know just how ridiculous it is, and then you dive into a little bit more of the research, and it's just even more ridiculous and arbitrary and punishing to these marginalized women than you even realized. Down to the point of jailing a 4-year-old.
It just makes me angry all around reading what happened.
Yeah, lots of Madeline Kahn gifs of flames on the side of my face going through this particular book. So, it was, but we had to kind of like come back to, okay, we don't want this book to sound shrill or angry or like a harpy screaming, even if we wanted to sometimes. So we had to come back to the fact that we love our subject matter. And so sort of trying to lead with love in this, because it is a very difficult topic, but we also are not going to be taking that tack of aggression or yelling at the ghosts or whatever to try to get them to interact with us. And we're not, Andrea and I are not paranormal investigators. We're ghost tour guides. Those are very, very different things.
It is.
And no, I myself don't feel the same call to be a paranormal investigator as I feel called to be a sort of a guide to haunted places,
Mm-hmm.
and a curator of the stories, and a kind of a folklorist of the stories that are told
Mm-hmm.
about these buildings. I myself don't feel like I need to go in and prove anything personally.
Mm-hmm.
I have a deep belief in the paranormal, and then I sort of let certain buildings speak to me. If I have uncanny encounters, I absolutely do share them, but only if I've ruled out everything else first.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's, I feel like I'm on a parallel track to the paranormal investigator, but
Yeah.
that's not something that Andrea and I personally either feel really called to do. Although some of the equipment is fun and we've been around it, we've certainly been around and been in and out of spaces where people have been doing investigations, and I have taken part in some, at least as an audience member,
Yeah.
because it's been a part of a historic house museum's fundraising campaign.
Yes. And they
And so,
make good
yeah,
fundraisers.
exactly. So that's, and that's an important part of all of this discussion too, is the fact that, like, monetizing these things is a very complicated, tricky, difficult thing.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of historic museums, that's a revenue stream for them that they can't afford not to do. So you really can't blame them. A lot of people are able to keep their doors open because of these things. So
Yeah,
it's like,
and that was an interesting point that you
yeah,
brought in at it was just the intro, but also touched again with the shirtwaist factory fire, was monetizing the dark history of these locations. And as a paranormal investigator, somebody who has guided
mhm,
historical events, we were just on one in Marietta as a fundraiser for a historical society, and also as an author of true history, haunted history. I was just like, I am part of this terrible cycle of abusing the spirits in whom we love. And it was kind of my like it broadened my horizons in the paranormal and how we look at it further, which I appreciated. Felt a lot of guilt for, though, because
n-
you're just like, I'm retelling the stories of how this girl horrifically murdered her family, and it's being sold for profit, but also we're documenting this happened and
right,
bringing
right.
it to the forefront and trying to take lessons to learn from
Right,
this.
that's the thing. It's all about the intent. So we're not trying to be a scold about the
Mhm.
industry that we ourselves are participant in. We're not trying to be a scold. We're just calling for the level of love and care and respect that I know that you're bringing to that. You're not like, I think, the fact that there is guilt in any of us means that we're actually conscious and cognizant of trying to not go at it in a crass way,
Mhm.
in a disrespectful way.
Mhm.
Telling the history in and of itself is not disrespectful. That is fact. If you are also aware of the power dynamics in play,
Mhm.
if you're not comfortable with difficult history, then I encourage, listeners to never go on a plantation tour, then, because you should be hearing about slavery and you should be hearing about how awful it is. And if you can't handle that, then sit with yourself.
Mm.
And that's, sort of who is telling the stories, too, and making sure that the voices of those who have been marginalized can be told from their perspectives too. And so I think a lot of times it's like a certain amount of, like, ethical, you can kind of tell whether a company is going at it from just the shock value or the jump scare aspect, or if they're doing it from a place of respect. And
Yeah.
so that's all that we're sort of calling for, is just making sure that everyone is respectful in the ways and the
Mhm.
angles in which they interact with this, and also willing to listen to those who might be from any representative group of a marginalized person
Yeah.
who is going to be their own sort of burdened heart to any
Yeah.
of these things. So,
And that came out loud and clear in the book. I think you two did a good job. Jen, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, actually, a couple of things. I think it's important that we tell the stories and not feel guilty about it, because you can't forget how you can't forget history, and people need to learn from it, especially how women were treated
Mhm.
all the time, and then the victims, and their names are remembered.
Mhm.
And a lot there's a fine line between that and kind of like turning serial killers into folk heroes.
Yeah.
right.
It's
And
kind of
I,
like what
like
we
with Dahmer,
Yeah.
I
Oh,
couldn't
yeah.
finish it. I couldn't
Yeah.
finish it because, and I'm fascinated by serial killers, but Evan Peters is a very attractive man, and that just sends the wrong message to me. And there's already people out there that want to emulate or they look up to these people.
That brings up a few different points. Like going back to our episode of Amy of Lick Road, where we actually looked into the actual murders that happened there and how the Amy of Lick Road story managed to keep the memory of these girls alive through folklore. And I've seen that play out in a book that I wrote, in a case that I covered in Indiana. But you also did that wonderfully in this book too, Leanna. And I had another point that I was going to make. Oh, yes. It's interesting with investigations when we do them. Even we took Jen to the Anchorage mansion as well. Christina, we all were there. Women get the most activity a lot during paranormal investigations because it is female ghosts who feel the most safe approaching them. Also children as well. And as an investigator, I'll go in, if it's an actual investigation, I'll go in and sit alone, and we get a lot of chatty talk from the female ghosts of the area, because if there's a lot of men, they're not going to speak. And then also if you get abusive men, they'll come through as well. And it's a double-edged sword. You have to sit and listen to their sass over whatever spirit box that you're using, a medium, whatever. I want to say medium, but not necessarily as a person. I mean, as a vehicle of communication. You get to listen to their sass, and you're like, I've recorded men making kissy noises at me during interviews. They were phantom men. They were not there, but I got a very chauvinistic man going whenever I was speaking during an interview with the house owner. And this is a ghost. So those attitudes can cross over. And this book covered that pretty well. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Well, but then your stories can set the record straight, too, if there's a misconception out there.
Yeah, to your point, Jen, I think the problem with the Dahmer, the miniseries, is that the victims' families were concerned. And I think if the victims' families are concerned, I think you need to kind of like listen to what they're saying.
Yeah.
Because
they
that's
were
still
showing how he did things.
Yeah.
I don't need to see that.
No.
I don't need to see it.
No, and there is a fine line between telling history and fetishizing it.
Yeah.
And so I absolutely believe, like as Jen said, we have to tell history so that these names are recorded and that the names are known and said, and that their historic injustices can be on our minds as cautionary tales. That's the thing, especially with the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. I use those horrific circumstances. And I tell the grisly details, not because I'm relishing in the grisly details, but because I really need to drive it home to people how we can't take our labor laws for granted. Because it was, this all happened because there were no labor laws at that time, and everything that could go wrong in that fire did go wrong. And it was a horrific loss of life. 146 people dead. 123 of them were women as young as 14 years old. And I get on a tear when I'm talking about it, and I always get choked up. And God forgive me if I ever stop getting choked up, because I should never be okay talking about that horrific fire. And the women that were locked into their death. Just the unconscionable aspect of that. But using that as a rallying cry to make sure that we in our modern era are keeping track and holding leaders accountable and holding factory owners accountable, because the garment industry worldwide still has fires and still has these problems. And it's not just the garment industry. It's many different industries where if safety protections are in any way eroded, these things can happen. And, companies will factor in a certain amount of acceptable loss of life. And I want to push back against that number. Whether it's women in 1911 or it's oil workers out on the BP Horizon when that blew up. And there's all of these things that are happening in our world that we just have to be cognizant of. And so in that case, the history really is quite truly contemporaneous. And I feel like I'm echoing some of the newspaper reporters at the time that were reporting on the fire, and they were using some very, very grisly details, but because they were trying to get up the point across that this was what these women the year prior had been marching about in what had been the largest labor uprising in our country's history, called the Uprising of the 20,000, which happened in 1910. And because of that uprising, because of that strike, and because of conversations happening at that point, led by young women, it did make change in the industry. Every single garment manufacturer did change some of their safety procedures, except for Triangle. And that's just what's and then it just was this horrific tragedy that just set everything in motion. But it shouldn't have had to take that. It should not have had to take that massive amount of death to create a livable workspace for people. But anyway,
well, memories are short. They're very short. People forget, and then they do what they just repeat themselves. And I think even with like the grisly details, as awful as they are to hear, people need to know what other people are capable of.
Yeah.
And that's what with all the true crime that I listen to, that's what I take from it. And I guess in a weird way, try to prepare myself in case I'm ever in a situation.
It helps.
Yeah.
And reading that particular chapter reminded me of two other landmark things, which were the Eastland disaster in Chicago, which happened just a few years later, killed more people than the Titanic. And then also in Chicago, the Iroquois Theater firebomb. So, which was, I think, a few years before Shirtwaist. But these were all they all have ghosts associated with them. And I think it's not so much as a sensationalization of going, look at the dead, everyone. It's more of remember that this happened. And ghost stories keep their memories alive. And it was all women and young children who died in these disasters. Every single one of them. Majority were women. Young women between 14 and 26.
Yeah, and you look at the steamboat fire that happened in 1914, the General Slocum, which was all women and children, because there weren't the safety inspections were not. They didn't look and inspect the life jackets. They didn't inspect the ship. They didn't, and then that happened in New York. And what was horrific about that one is that everyone was watching from the shore, and it happened like 10 feet from the shore. But because of the way the currents go, they couldn't get to them.
Oh.
And some people died just trying to get to them. From there's a really nasty back current that was like unable to cross. Again, the same way that like the Triangle Shirtwaist victims were looking at the fire department just 2 floors below, but the fire chief had not been given enough budget to create ladders to go tall enough to the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors. Their ladders only reached to the 6th floor.
Yes.
It just, seeing help within reach and then not being able to get to it. It's just like, there's just the sort of the insult to injury in all of that. And there's just that, there is that sort of helplessness, even when I'm telling these stories, there's a helplessness in that, but I just sort of use it as a rallying cry to make sure that we are not relaxing on our duty to make sure that we are being the best fellow citizen to our people that we can be. And because it's just like, in these cases, we have to look out for each other if sometimes people who are making decisions might not. So then that's going to have to be up to us.
Yeah. So moving on to a more cheery ghost story.
My girl.
Would be Ma Green, which I know, Christina, you have been chomping at the bit to talk about. I know I ordered this book the minute it came on available for pre-order so we could talk about Ma Green. I have been watching the update status through my bookstore for 6 months. Yeah. So, Christina, you really love Ma Green.
I mean, how could you not love her?
Yeah.
I mean, everything about her is so contemporary, actually. Her gender bending, being a captain of a boat when women were considered bad luck in the ships.
When ironically ships are named after women.
Yep.
And I love, just as a side note, that there's the Delta Queen and her sister, the Delta King. So, yeah. It's so, Leanna, can you tell us about Ma Green?
I love Ma Green. Okay, so Mary Becker Green. Mary Becker Green is her name. And she was born in the 19th century, and she lived a long life. And she married a steamboating man.
Mm.
And so her husband and her founded the Green steamer line. So it was the Green family steamer line, and she was co-owner in that company.
Mm-hmm.
And she watched him at the wheel fastidiously. She learned. She was a sponge for information. And she just was one of those people that just like loved life and lived life and learned as she lived. And there really was just about, it seems like there's nothing she couldn't do.
Mm-hmm.
And so she was also just this very evidently affable and fun lady, just a fun presence to be around. And there's just some wonderful pictures of her. There's a two-part story on the website called Weelunk, and I can give you guys the links for the show notes for these two articles from West Virginia history. So her history is tied between West Virginia history as well as Ohio history.
Yeah, she was born in Marietta. So this just ties us back to the last episode where we were in Marietta.
So and it's such a great, and so she was aware of rivers right early on, and watching rivers very early on. So rivers really fascinated her, which was good because you need to understand rivers deeply if you're going to be living on them. And so her and her husband were, traversing the up and down both the Ohio, going along the Mississippi, doing sort of riverboat tours basically, and people would buy tickets just for Ma Green's company, even though there's no alcohol allowed on the ship. So she was an absolute teetotaler. So she was a lady who liked to have fun. She would go dancing. Oh, she would dance in the ballroom all the time, but there was no alcohol on the ship. So that her company had to be good for people to forsake booze to go on her boats. So she gave birth during like an ice jam. And so, she in the middle of this, crisis on the ship, gives birth, goes back to piloting, take turns with the baby, sews curtains for the guest rooms, and then checks in on everybody. I mean, it just like she really was the woman who had it, who could kind of do it all. And was completely unapologetic about any of it. So she was the first woman to obtain a steamboat pilot's license in 1892. And this really paved the way. It's like there was some fantastic articles written about her. She said yes to any challenge. She was on she finished first in a riverboat race. And so there was a lot of press about all of this. And she was just, basically very upfront about, of course I won. I know what I'm doing, but she was never mean. She never put anybody down. She was always, again, this kind of lovable, affable lady, and some pictures of her at the helm, this sort of stately looking woman, but she's got this like sparkle in her eye. She's got this little smile, and you just know that she's a firecracker, right? Even just looking at her, you can tell. So she really paved the way. A lot of other like women applied for various trade licenses in various different fields after she kind of broke that open. Because I think in a lot of times, if you're told you can't do something, there really is a bit of an internalized oppression that sets in. And a lot of people think that, well, then I can't, society doesn't allow me to do this, so I can't do this. Then there's an example of somebody who does do something, and you're like, oh, maybe I can. So she really did, just by being a living example, really open a lot of doors for female pilots across any kind of medium. So in terms of her, the Delta Queen was sort of the ship that was kind of her baby. When her husband passed away, she and her son then managed the company after, and she stayed on the boats and was still keeping it as a family business. And steamboats were going a little bit out of style by the time that they purchased the Delta Queen, and they had purchased it at auction for like a very small amount of money for what it was worth. And they refurbished it a bit, and they put it back onto they had this elaborate getting it up to the Ohio River was like a whole production number. And I won't go into all the details, but I mentioned it in the book. It was an elaborate labor of love to get this boat back to Ohio at all. And
It went
but
through
they
the
believed in it.
Panama Canal.
I mean, it's wild. It's
Yeah.
honestly wild. It was boarded up for some of it. Some of it had to be towed along, and then some of it could do on its own. And it was just like kind of this incredible, around the world in 80 rivers. And it was, they just believed in this boat. And so she really, really bonded with this boat. And she had a stateroom on the boat that was hers. And that was where she spent most of her time until she died, in the stateroom of the Delta Queen. And activity from Ma Green's spirit was almost instantaneous. She really never left that ship. She is still captaining that ship, which is the title of my chapter on her, is Still Captaining Her Ship. And her presence would be felt in many different ways. She would be, if there was something wrong with the ship, she would wake engineers or staff people up with a shove, with a shout, with jostling, with something. There were phone calls made to the captain's quarters from the stateroom that would, when no one was there. Her picture has been known to come to life when people are looking at it, and it's like her life force, because she was this lively lady, has been imbued into every image of her, and she would literally actually came to life through a documentarian's camera when he was focusing in on her, and the picture moved. And so the details about her, it's easy to kind of ascribe this sort of larger than life aspect to her, but she really kind of, if anybody deserves this larger than life aspect, it's her. And my favorite thing, my very favorite thing about all her hauntings is that the company who was managing the Delta Queen after her passing had the audacity to try to build a bar in her ballroom. Ma Green would not tolerate alcohol on her ships. I mean, did she stutter? No, Mary Becker Green was not about to have alcohol on her ship. So as they started construction on that bar, what do you know? A barge crashes into the Delta Queen right in the ballroom, destroys the bar, and when they pull the barge out, everyone stares in astonishment at the name of that ship, the Mary B. It's like the ultimate mic drop.
Oh, yes, it is.
From beyond. And when I read that story, when I read about this, I literally was like in this exact chair, and I went, oh, because it literally was like someone had won a goal in a sports ball moment. Like, it just felt like this is wonderful, this delightful, like, no way. But it's so, I feel like, but if it could be anybody that did that, of course it was going to be Mary Becker Green. Like, yes. She just was not, she was this force of nature. So again, I keep saying that, but it just,
she knew
I'm really
her
excited
rivers.
For you.
She knew her boats.
And she knew what she didn't want, and she did not want you to be drunk on her ship.
Exactly.
My God. And I'm so tickled.
Yes. Yeah, she's such an amazing lady. And she still haunts the Delta Green, or not the Delta Green.
Oh, that was a good slip up.
That was a good slip up.
She
really
probably
should be called that.
Would appreciate that.
Yeah, the Delta Queen
called after her name.
It hovers between being ported in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and then St. Louis, Missouri. It depends on. I think it's still Captain Williams that is the head.
Yeah, I think so.
And his wife, which I love their meet cute story.
Thanks to Ma.
Yeah, it's
so I should say she's a matchmaker, and in her many list of talents, she's also a matchmaker, because there was a basically the purser for the ship and the captain of the ship. There was a spectral encounter, and it was them discussing all of this that sort of like in the middle of the night brought them together with this inexplicable moment. And then they later would say, yeah, we're kind of, Ma Green's kind of responsible for us being together, which I think is fantastic. So, that was really delightful to have a change of pace story where it is not doom and gloom. And this is a woman who died as she lived, loving what she did, without trauma or drama, and that she had this, loving family and considered her passengers her family, and vice versa. She was dancing the Virginia Reel the day before she died. So, she went out, like, and it was just one of those, goes to sleep and doesn't wake up kind of thing. And, hey, if that's how I hope to go, I guess, you couldn't ask for a better way. And then just because I think ships in and of themselves have such a capacity to be haunted anyway.
Yeah.
So it just is kind of a fun aspect of, women are very associated, in folklore with water in general. You mentioned the fact that ships are always called she. There are so many ghost stories about ships. And I think that this is just this was a way to kind of bring all of these, large kind of parallel topics together into one quirky lady's story. So
yes.
And also just kind of a breaking the glass ceiling moment. So
yes. And what struck me reading this is people are still paying money to go on a boat ride with Ma Green. Yeah, to this day. She's been gone for what, 80 years? No.
Yeah.
Almost.
Almost.
Yeah.
Yeah. It was a long, full life. And I love that she, kept it in a family business for as long as she could. And then it's still, I think everyone on that ship still considers her a part of the family, and it's a sort of extended family. I think that I hope that ship never goes out of service, because, and its fate was not secure. Even just a few years ago. So that was kind of a precarious thing. And I was like, I just was very concerned. I was like, oh no, what's Ma going to do if her ship is like out of commission? I was like, oh no, what happens? And then I was concerned about what happens if they like decommission that ship. Oh no.
I would hope they turn it into a museum or something.
Right.
Wouldn't you think?
It's pretty
I would hope.
Yeah. It has a lot of passionate followers.
It does.
That boat.
I hope that they will get a few more from our podcast today, and a few more from reading this book.
Yes.
Because I want, so take a trip on the Delta Queen, everybody. If you ever see it,
keep them in business.
Near you.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
I know. I will buy a ticket when they're back in business. Like,
do you remember Tall Stacks?
Yes.
Oh, I loved Tall Stacks.
Yeah,
I was on the Delta Queen during Tall Stacks. I had to
for people who don't know what Tall Stacks is, please explain.
Me? Okay. I think because I was never able to go to it, and I only became aware of it because they worked at the Empire.
I was still in a cornfield during Tall Stacks, so this was all new to me. This is only legend. So
it was basically a steamboat festival where all the working steamboats came to Cincinnati, and everybody just went and looked at them.
It was amazing. You could take tours of them. I went to both of them.
Oh,
you could take tours of them, and it was a really neat event. I'm surprised they haven't done it again.
I know.
I think it's got to be a money issue.
It was a money issue. And then obviously the pandemic wouldn't have allowed for any of that either. But yeah, that I totally went to that as a kid. And my parents reminded me, because part of my book tour was going out to see my sister in Denver, where she runs a brewery there. And so my parents went with me to that, and we were talking about this chapter. And my parents were like, yeah, when we took you to Tall Stacks, you were on the Delta Queen. And I was like, oh, that was of course it was. And I feel bad that I hadn't even mentioned that in the chapter, that, by the way, I was on this ship. I was on the ship. So you heard it here, folks. I was on the ship.
I've never been on it. I've only seen pictures of it. So what was it like as a kid?
Just, enormous and grand. I think when you see one of the, when you see a truly magnificent ship like that, it just seems like such a behemoth. And it's probably also relative to being a small child, but I just, there was something magical about, the sort of the crowns on the top of all the steam stacks, which is how I had always thought the Queen City was named, for the crowns on all the steamboats, because, Cincinnati was like the honeymoon capital of the country in a chunk of the 19th century, because of Music Hall, because of all the industry there, because of all these wonderful picturesque views, and because of the riverboat cruises were considered very romantic. And so I had always been told that the Queen City was because of the crowns on the tall stacks, the smokestacks, or the steam stacks rather. Sorry. But then I had to clarify. I was like, before I say that in this book, I should probably clarify, when was the first time that the Queen City was used? Oh, It's Longfellow. Okay.
Mhm.
Okay. So we go, all right. Okay. I guess it can go to a poet. Fine.
Yeah.
So yeah, but it's this interesting thing though, where you hear something as a kid and you're like, this is how
Yeah.
this nickname of this place came to be.
Yeah.
And it's, sticks with you. And then I'm just glad I hadn't dug my heels in on that one.
Yeah, and Charlotte, North Carolina has a lot to say about Cincinnati also being known as the Queen City.
Oh, really? I
did
always
hear.
thought it was the hills
Oh.
formed a crown.
Oh, that's a neat
All the,
take.
like,
the
Lassie
Seven
House,
Hills. What is it?
Hill.
Seven Hills or something?
That makes a
Seven
lot of
Hills.
sense too.
That also works.
But
That
I
also.
did not grow up here, so
Mhm.
take it with a grain of salt. I really don't know.
I knew it from Longfellow.
Yeah. So I do mention the poem in the chapter because it was important to get it down into when was it first in print, because it had been colloquially possibly known as the Queen City before it was in print, but it's like tracing back the first time in print. That's sort of helpful in our line of work, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, now it's the logo.
Well, yeah. Yeah.
Oh yeah, no. Now that it's got merch.
Yeah.
I mean, it is refreshing because just in your book, so many of the stories about women are traumatic ones, and the idea that somebody stayed around not because of a traumatic thing that happened to them, but because they're having so much fun and lived such a full life that they wanted to still be involved after they died, I think is kind of a game changer in a way. I mean, it's kind of a unique story.
Mhm.
Has there been much done about, like, have they made movies, or you said documentaries? Is it not gotten as much attention? Maybe because it doesn't have the trauma. There's not victims. There's not.
I think honestly that's where she's just sort of this delightful story of history. I think there's probably not as much angst as to why there hasn't been like a movie about her. I mean, I would love to watch a movie about her, but I do think you hit on it in that there's not really a lot of conflict. There's just, but I even though I would just watch, obviously it wasn't always easy to be navigating these ships. There was often great dangers involved, and these ships could easily catch fire. Too. So like there was all kinds of possible dangers that were happening. So I feel like that, there would be enough conflict to do a film about her. But, I was unfamiliar with her story outside of reading some ghost books about Cincinnati. And she came up a couple of times, and I talked to a few historians, and they pointed me to some resources about her. So I think that there might be more that's going to be uncovered too. I think Queens of the Queen City is going to do a little bit more about her as well, as a blog. Because I know one of the historians there was going to be speaking with some of the extended family members. So,
oh, nice.
So I think, the history is always changing. That's the great thing about this. And there's even things that are still coming to light about some of the historic houses that we write about. In fact, there was just something that the Merchants House just discovered with their house historian, that they were like, oh, by the way, we just found something that kind of disproves some of the things that we've been saying for a while now. So, and now it's such an interesting food for thought. And I'm not going to share all of that because it's like, that's the museum's business to curate. And I don't want to speak out of turn or to speak without a full picture of their sources. But they've, found a couple of letters and things like that. And it's like, oh, wow. History is, again, always changing the more material we have. So hopefully there'll be more about Ma to celebrate as we continue.
Yay.
I want to see a movie or something, or a documentary. I mean, it seems like, there's other documentaries and stuff about, and I hate to.
Well, remember, Christina, we were going to do that comic.
I think we should.
There you go. Totally do that.
Yeah, we were
something about her.
Incredible people of Cincinnati, and Ma Green would be number one.
Jen's got an idea.
What's your idea, Jen?
What is it, Jen?
Well, Ma Green herself wasn't necessarily dramified, right? But you can put a drama around her, on a fictional one around her on the boat, and she like washes it or something.
Sends a barge through it.
Historical fiction.
What?
Sends a barge through it when you got something to say. When in doubt, send a barge through it.
But I think
that's the T-shirt.
You're gonna win the argument.
There could be a movie on her, a fictional one, but based on true people.
Yeah. Now, I will say,
I think a lot of historical fiction does a good job with that, fictionalizing things around the people. Absolutely.
Like
Yeah.
Outlander. Yeah.
and I mean, she still saw a lot of trauma. Like her husband and her sons both died on the boat.
Yeah.
So there's still a lot. There's still enough stuff to write about. She
Well,
had
you
a
think
very
about,
interesting
like,
life. You don't need to stretch too far to find
Mm-mm.
anything interesting to write about her.
I mean, you think about shows like Frontier. What was that one? What was that movie with that TV show with the woman that was the doctor that was on for like?
Oh,
Dr.
Quinn
In our
Medicine
childhood,
Woman.
Dr.
Yeah,
Quinn Medicine Woman?
like
Yeah.
you have all of these shows like that. Why couldn't you have like, Ma Green, steamboat captain, and have a couple seasons of it? I mean, there's a lot more interesting stuff than probably
Because
was in that
people
show.
outside of Cincinnati, not a lot of people, I think, know of her.
No.
But that
They know
people
of the
love
boat.
people
Sorry,
love
I was
WK.
just thinking of like the USS Ma Green somewhere
Oh.
in Star Trek.
I love
Exactly.
this.
Oh yes, she
I
needs to
think
be in
Janeway
Star
would
Trek.
sign off on that. I
Yeah.
think Janeway would totally.
I think we should write to the creators of Star Trek and tell them to do
A
a
Ma Green.
USS Ma
At
Green.
least do lower decks first. That may
Right.
that may
Well,
work.
so
Somebody tweet at them tomorrow and tell them they need a Ma Green, USS Ma Green.
There we go.
The great thing about putting her in the I was insistent that, and I didn't get any pushback about this, but I definitely wanted to make sure that she went into the mother's chapter, because I point out in her story that there's lots of different ways to be a mother. And she was called Ma Green by everybody outside of her family because she was kind of like everyone's maternal figure. Anybody who was on that ship was her kid in that regard, and so everyone said Ma really fondly. And so that, I think that again, she's also was mothering the ship, so, and she definitely, her spirit is looking out for the ship as if it is one of her children, because she's looking out for anything that might be wrong with it, and waking someone up to it. So I think I think we, expanding the idea of what a caretaker is helps, just society in general not feel like it's only locked into one gender, or it's locked into one way of being a mother, or way of being a caretaker, a way of being a provider. And so I just thought that was kind of a fun way in which she was a mother across several different ways of what that might mean.
Yeah.
And
I mean,
love.
didn't they
It was all about love.
Didn't they say that she, like, the food on her boat was the best? Like, like the creature comforts were the best. Like, it was one of those things where she thought of things other people didn't think of.
Yep.
Exactly. She was making decisions to make it home, to make it feel like a home while you were there. That's why she was very meticulous about, making sure everything had curtains and the right table settings and all of these things that were, not any lavish, not anything that was like some sort of complete innovation. It was just thinking about that hospitality angle, that domesticity, and making that very profitable. So, but she was looking at it with the eye of someone who would have been
She's a good
managing the
businesswoman.
house.
Mhm.
I mean,
Business savvy.
The domestic sphere was one that women were expected to know intimately. So she just expanded that onto the ship and then made that feel like it was a respite for people, not just transportation, but actual relaxation too.
Yes. So talking about expanding.
Yes.
And looking out for people beyond just their own families, we can talk about Sarah Winchester.
My girl.
Yes.
My girl.
We're going to different coastline.
Different coastline.
Different coastline. And
Have
you've
been
been
to the
to the
house.
Winchester.
Okay.
Yes.
Sorry.
Winchester Mystery House. That's where we're going. Expansion to the max. Millions of dollars.
Millions of dollars.
And you
160
got
rooms.
to visit the Mystery House, which is a place I have not been to. I don't know, Christina and Jen, have you been to the Winchester? Okay, we're getting not.
I have not. Where is it? I'm sorry.
San
Jen.
Jose.
San Jose. Yes, I haven't been there.
Yeah.
I was not about to.
Is this the weird house that's like? I've seen stuff about it, but
the labyrinthine 160 room mansion.
Mm-hmm. Stairs that go to nowhere, doors that go outside, but from like the second story. Built with the guidance of the spirit world.
And you'll get lost
So
in there, and even the
it
tour
was,
guides don't even know everything about it.
yeah, it takes tour guides it takes tour guides months of repetition to get through any of that. The tours that I took while I was there, I was absolutely confounded. I was not about to write about this house or this woman without going to it. So the minute that we got the green light on the book, I obviously had to wait for pandemic to be clear. So I waited. So the Winchester chapter was like later in my writing, because I wanted to wait until it was safe enough to get on a plane and get out there. And so I'd gotten on my vaccinations, and I was like looking at the clock, and I was like, okay, all right. And looking at my time frame, and I was like, all right, I've got a window to get out there and to start writing. And I'd contacted the house historian, Janin Boehm, who is a wonderful lady. And she very kindly took me around and took me into places that were not open to the tours. And I got a chance to talk with her so I spent the entire day there, and went back around the grounds the next day, and just spend as much time as I possibly could in my limited capacity there. But it's one of those spaces where you know that there is the weight of this being a haunted property. So when you read this chapter, you're going to hear a lot of history, and you're going to learn a lot about Sarah Winchester, and you're going to have a lot of things debunked about this house in reading this chapter, because all of the things that were said during her life about her and about the house and the reasons why she was doing what she was doing are all things that were put onto her, sort of foisted onto her, by people trying to get their heads around why she was doing what she was doing. She never gave a reason for why she was doing what she was doing. And that's why there was so much room for speculation. But that to me was what was very interesting. So my chapter was really trying to separate fact from fiction, to give Sarah back a bit of her own story, and to try to write a chapter that was differentiated from Colin Dickey's Ghostland, which is very much a comparison title to our book. And we quote Colin Dickey and Ghostland often in our book. And I quote Colin Dickey in the Winchester Mystery House chapter too. And so that was a little daunting, thinking, all right, how can I differentiate from what is a very, very good chapter that's also myth busting about this house, while still telling you, yeah, but it's still a haunted house, though. It's just not haunted in the way that you think.
Yes. And that was one of the things I wanted to point out very early in the chapter when you're introducing it. It is haunted. Yes, it's a haunted house because we've made it haunted. So, yes.
Exactly. So this was definitely a story of a lot of fabrication around a lady who had a lot of money. And because she didn't flaunt that money, the only way in which we really knew she had a lot of money was that she was spending a lot of money on this house. But what people don't know is that the house began to be self-sustaining from its orchards pretty early on. So while the initial purchase of the house and the fact that she paid her workers twice the rate of anyone in California meant she had a very loyal workforce, and the house again was pretty much self-sustaining. And then the other things she was doing with her money, she was giving a lot of money anonymously to charity throughout her life. So I should probably go back and say why this lady had a lot of money. So Sarah Winchester was the wife of William Winchester, who was the heir to the Winchester Repeating Arms Company fortune. The Winchester family had made their money. They were from Connecticut, New Haven, Connecticut. And so was Sarah Purdy, Lockwood Purdy. That was her maiden name. They were from New Haven, Connecticut, and the Winchester family had made their fortune initially in innovating men's shirts to be easier to manufacture and also easier to wear and to style. And they lost a lot of money during the Civil War because they refused to participate in slave-based cotton. And they were ardent supporters of the Union cause, even though it was a great blow to their business. So Sarah and William got married in 1864. So in the midst of the Civil War, and had a very subdued ceremony due to the sort of gravity of that time. And so right around this time, the Oliver Winchester, William's father, Sarah's father-in-law, had purchased a company, the Winchester Repeating Rifle Company, or it was a repeating rifle company, and named it the Winchester Repeating Arms Company, and had some innovators in the same way he'd been innovating with men's shirts. How can we more efficiently design this product, and created a very, very successful gun. This had been a gun that he tried to get the Union to buy. So he had been working on this before William and Sarah were married. Oliver had been trying to get Union contracts with the Winchester repeating rifle, and that didn't end up materializing. It would have actually quite helped the Union cause, honestly, because we were getting into, in this country, the first mechanized war, really. But the Union didn't take him up on it. What it did become famous for was westward expansion. And with westward expansion, you have a lot of Native American genocide. Mm-hmm. And that is something that is a very real aspect of our country and the real dark part of our history. Now, the Winchester rifle was not necessarily used exclusively against Native American populations. Native Americans used the Winchester rifle often. They would call the Winchester rifle the spirit gun because it kept firing. So there was this sort of spirit-based thing even, put onto this rifle. And so it had kind of been billed as sort of the gun that won the West, when it was also just thought of as a bit of a implement of lawlessness in certain areas too. So there's this very, very complicated relationship that our country has always had to guns that was tied up in the name Winchester. Mm-hmm. So William died of tuberculosis, and so Sarah dealt with loss of her father-in-law, her husband, and her baby daughter in swift succession. Mm-hmm. It was in the 1880s. So Sarah and William loved each other very deeply. And so when he died, he left everything to, and I quote from his will, "my beloved Sarah," and made her executrix of his will and his estate. And then when Oliver Winchester had died, his shares went to his son, which then went to Sarah. And she was dealing with these two estates separately while grieving the loss of her infant daughter, who had died from a condition known as marasmus, which is when infants cannot digest. And so her baby daughter starved to death in a month. And I just can't even imagine it. I can't even imagine that where the doctors could do nothing. It was a condition that was not treatable at that time.
It is difficult to treat today.
There
are babies that die of this today. It's as a new mom, that is the thing you are focused on, is that kid is eating because of this. Yeah.
It's so here was these absolutely epic tragedies happening to this lady who was just this all around, from all accounts, very nice, quiet, introverted lady who is in the middle of New Haven high society, which she's not a high society lady. She does not necessarily need or want to be fancy. She doesn't want to be having to entertain. She just kind of wants to go out at this point after all of this loss. She wants to go out and be with her family, her extended family, her sisters, because one of her dear sisters has gone out west, and she thinks, I loved going out west with William. I loved San Francisco area. So she goes out to check in on the Winchester Company in the San Francisco office and just kind of takes a tour around. And one of the men Ned Rambo, who's working on the Winchester office in San Francisco, takes her around to the San Jose Valley, and she falls in love with it because it reminds her of a trip to the Llanada Vesta in some of her mountainous Spanish, so the mountains of Spain, where she had this incredible trip with William on their honeymoon. So she kind of creates her own sort of respite out in San Jose, where she doesn't have to be a part of Connecticut high society, and she doesn't have to be thrust into that.
Pause. They did not honeymoon in Cincinnati?
They did not. At that point, no. They
Okay.
actually took a European tour.
Well,
But they should have
like
come
the
back to
smart choice.
Cincinnati. They should have come back to Cincinnati.
Yeah,
I
sorry.
don't
It's
think they're.
just
Oh,
it
it's
was too
that's
easy.
fair. That's fair. I set that one up.
Mm.
I should have seen that one coming.
Mm.
So there was a real romanticism about why she picked what she picked, and where she decided to sort of relocate to. And so she bought this farmhouse, and within 6 months had added a couple of stories and about 15 rooms to it.
Wow.
And then it just kept expanding. And it just kept expanding. And so here's this really, really wealthy lady. So she really was hoping that her name and any of the things associated with it would not necessarily that Californians wouldn't care about that, but no, they did, because here she was inheriting millions of dollars in 19th century money.
Mm-hmm.
She's got like 8 million in 19th century money. So this is like a lot of money. She even was boggled by, she couldn't even really figure out how much she exactly had. And I don't even know if she even had an exact account of how much she actually had. She paid other people to keep track of that for her. And then, so here she was building onto this farmhouse, ostensibly, we think, to maybe house her entire family there at some point. But then it just was never quite finished. And you know how it is when you want things to be perfect, and you want to be able to do something for, this kind of grand reason, and it just doesn't quite ever materialize. And that in and of itself is a mystery as to why it didn't end up being a place that housed her whole family. Many of her family did end up living there. Her niece Daisy was sort of a surrogate daughter. And so people just really thought, why is this lady doing what she's doing? And they started telling rumors. And so one of the things about the Winchester mystery is that people were saying, oh, she must be tormented by something. She's left everything for the other side of the country, and now she's building onto this house. And so the concept of her building to appease the spirits, and the idea that she had consulted a medium who had told her to go do this to appease the spirits of those killed by the Winchester rifle, that was posited by people just trying to figure out a methodology to a wealthy lady that they were nosy about, because she didn't entertain when she was out there. And people out there who were in high society in California were like, well, why am I not invited to this new grand house? Why am I not going to a dinner party at the wealthiest lady's house? And so the elite of the area were really put out and nasty about it. And she was kind of famous for not admitting people to the house, except for neighborhood school children who she would let run around in the gardens. And so she was this very shy, reclusive figure who was always seen in mourning, because she never stopped mourning for her beloved William. So she was devoted to William and kind of besotted with him, and just was much like Queen Victoria, always traveled with a picture of Prince Albert, and put it on her pillow or whatever. I mean, she, Sarah took that love of her life kind of very seriously, and was seen in mourning for the rest of her days. Even when Victorian mourning was well out of fashion. She died in the 1930s. So this is a woman who had lived a really long life and had seen a lot of things come and go, and never really ever gave any kind of answer as to why she did the things that she did. And the things being, build a crazy looking house. That doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. And here's why she was doing that, at least from what the actual records can tell us. She was subscribed to a bunch of different architectural magazines, and she is known to have sketched out all of the plans for the house on napkins and papers and everything. All of the designs around the house are Sarah's designs. Her and William oversaw the building of their in-laws' house, and it was one of the happiest times when they loved sharing the concept of putting this house together and talking with the contractors and overseeing all of that. And they both really took to it. And so in some ways, this was her sort of building her dream house via her own methods. She really was I think she would have loved to go into architecture. I think she would have been a great architect. But of course, society would not have allowed that. So she had some money to burn. So her passion, people spend their money, any sort of side money they have, they might spend on something that they're passionate about. And her passion was architecture. And so she just used the house as her sketchbook. And she loved paying people well. And she gave people houses on her property. She would give them to her staff people. She would buy up surrounding areas that she could then have orchards. And then any of the houses that were there, she would give to her staff. So it was this big extended family on this 160 acres at that point that she had, matching the 160 rooms of her mansion. I don't know that she did that deliberately, but it was a comparable number. And the concept that she was always building, it was just I think how this must have happened is it was an offhanded comment. Oh, she's always building. And then somebody took that literally, like she's always building 24/7 every moment of the day. So there was this concept that there was an obsession. She also was an insomniac. And also people are nosy. So if you saw a woman all in black wandering in the middle of the night, people started telling rumors about she's holding midnight seances.
Yes.
To contact her beloved dead husband, because she never remarried. So here's this lady with all this money, and she is the queen of this castle, and there is no man running it. There's some staff guys around. She hired a Japanese gardener and she paid him exquisitely. In fact, named him in her will, gave him money in her will even. And the fact, though, that she had a Japanese gardener at a time that was very racist was also like suspect to others. The fact that she was willing to hire people of color on her estate, it was like that branded her as more of a weirdo in the image of the time. And that this is a lot of what I have written about. I'm going to show this book, because it's I was obsessed with this book, and I'm still obsessed with the book. It's called Captive of the Labyrinth by Mary Jo Ignoffo. And it's just a very detailed, comprehensive biography of Sarah Winchester's life. So I really owe a lot to this. So for me, I was curious about, okay, well then what got it to be the Winchester Mystery House today? And why is this still this pervasive kind of myth that she was haunted by spirits, that she was building obsessively to appease the spirits, when that's not founded at all? She didn't name the house in her will. Didn't name the house in her will. All the interior, the beautiful furnishings were all auctioned off, and the house was deemed by legal counsel of no value.
Oh, jeez.
And so here was this potentially about to be torn down building when a guy who had run an amusement park thought, the mystery house at my amusement park is really popular. And here's this very confounding, confusing house with all of these weird twists and turns, would make a really good mystery house. And there's a lot of rumors about this lady already. So why don't I open this house of this crazy lady? And the year after Sarah's death, she died in the house of a heart attack. And her bedroom is there. You can visit it. And there's definitely a weight of, I didn't realize when I walked into the room where she died that it was the room where she died. But I felt time absolutely stop. And I felt, when you're in that weight of a haunted space and it feels different, just feels different. And I just knew something was like really heavy and important, not necessarily sad, but just deeply important. So there was the weight of import that was definitely in her room. And then I found out that that's where she passed. And I thought, okay, all right. Well, and the house loves her and she loves the house. It always did. But the year after she died, the Winchester Amusement Company opened. So that was the new venture of this house that had been deemed of no value. And it was opened as a ready-made attraction. And then that's when the perpetuation of haunted by spirits, midnight seances, all that stuff, any of the things that had been sort of gossiped about as possibilities for her behavior was made codified by the Winchester Amusement Company.
Right.
And, they added the iteration of 13 to everything. There were a few things that had the number 13 already in the house, steps, other hooks, things like that. All of these things were added. The seance room was like a gardener's bedroom. It's a small room.
Are you telling me the stained glass spider window with the 13 threads through it was an addition?
The spiderweb windows were hers.
Oh.
That's what's interesting too, is that spiderweb themes were really popular in the 19th century.
Yeah.
Clara Driscoll was a woman who designed all of Louis Comfort Tiffany's stained glass lamps. She was, a lady designed those, by the way. I do a one-woman show as Clara, so also from Ohio, so very important lady.
Yeah.
So she did a lot of very famous designs, and she used spiderwebs in a lot of her designs. So that was actually just sort of a popular thing in the 19th century as a motif. And, I sort of posit that, well, of course she would like spiders. They were always building. And so, so those were hers. But the other iterations of like 13 candles in the chandelier in the ballroom was what Disney modeled the Haunted Mansion ballroom off of, though. So there's that haunted parallel. But that a lot of those iterations of 13 were added. And the quirk of the seance room is that when you go out the door, you can't get back into it. So you actually have to go all the way around the house to get back into that particular room. But it really was probably a workroom or a gardener's bedroom. So sorry to spoil some of the fun here of this. But what I find really interesting is that had the Winchester Amusement Company not opened, we probably would not still have this house today. So here this goes back to what we were saying is sometimes haunted properties, they actually have to embrace the ghost narratives to be able to keep the doors open. So in this case, would I be talking to you about Sarah's real history if we didn't still have the house? If lies weren't told about her, would I be able to be here to tell you the truth about her? She gave millions and millions of dollars to charity in then money. She created a $2 million endowment to create the William Winchester Tuberculosis Hospital back in New Haven. That was part of her life's work. And she was known to just be an anonymous benefactor to a whole lot of various charitable causes through her life. And her staff just adored her. So the house is haunted. It's haunted by the staff that loved the building and are still taking care of it.
Yeah.
And, and the fact that her gardener, that the money was left in her will to him, and he named his granddaughter is partly named for her too. So there was this extended, she loved having her staff have kids in the house. Who wouldn't after losing your child? She was known sort of as this quiet aunt to, neighborhood children, who didn't see the addled, kind of crazed person that other people were putting on to her. She also suffered from rheumatoid arthritis, deeply painful condition in her later years, and it deformed some of her muscles. And so she was always seen with a veil because she didn't like how it had deformed some of her face. And so, again, people not knowing that would just see this shrouded figure and thought that she was just this eccentric, when it was a real condition that she was dealing with. So, I loved writing about her, learning about her. That house it has a very powerful energy. Some of the reasons why some of the things don't add up is because after this 1906 earthquake, she didn't rebuild some of what had fallen. So some of the doors go to nowhere because there was part of the house that fell apart and they just took the debris away.
I see.
So some of it is a little bit more mundane than is actually mysterious. And some of it was she didn't like how her architectural, her sketchbook had turned out. And so they just didn't continue with that particular iteration. So some of it was just an untrained architect, experimenting in real scale with her ideas, and not all of it would work out. So they would do stuff over it. So there really is this nesting doll quality to the house, because sometimes she was just putting additions on because it wouldn't always work and wouldn't always seem how she had envisioned it. I thought I was going to be very claustrophobic in there, but she actually constructed it with a great deal of skylights and passageways that allow for much more light to come in than I would have thought. But goodness, are you disoriented? So that's really the most fascinating thing to me, is that I have no idea where, even looking at my pictures I took in that house, I have no idea where I was or how I got there, even though I was led through, and I literally was so turned around. I don't have a good sense of direction. So I literally would be lost, and someone would have to find my bones in that house, because I would end up somewhere I couldn't get back from, and then I'd be a goner. But yeah, that's I was so concerned about getting this chapter right, and by doing right by her, and also trying to make sure I was still giving you, dear reader, an entertaining story. I was
Mhm.
deeply stressed about this, but stressed out of love. So I actually went to her grave in New Haven, Connecticut. I like prayed at her grave for her permission to talk about all of this and like her blessing.
Right.
And you know, just because, again, for me, it all comes down to respect. Because I just wanted to set the record straight that she was not, in fact, a mad woman. She should have been in the Widows chapter, but she is in the quote unquote mad women chapter because that's what people said about her and assumed that she was.
Yeah.
And so that's why it's like, well, let's reclaim that particular narrative. And of course, you know, the only reason why she didn't have a harder time is that she was too wealthy for anybody to institutionalize.
Yeah.
So, you know, no one would have dared to actually like say these things to her face. They
Right.
just sat behind her back and, you know, and then just gossiped about the house in general. But yeah, so Jan and Boehm, the house historian, you know, as I say in the chapter, she said, I have to walk a very fine line because people come here to this house with expectations of a haunted house. And we have to give them something. And so we preface a lot of things with legend says.
Yes.
And it was rumored that, and all of these various other things that they have to sort of put a disclaimer on, but they still have to talk about the myths because the myths persist.
Yes.
And have persisted. So, and certainly, and I loved Dame Helen Mirren in the movie Winchester about her, Sarah Winchester. And the only thing that is true about that film is that Helen Mirren portrays Sarah Winchester as a very kind and intelligent woman. That is true. Also exquisite Black Victorian regalia. Yes. I love life goals for fashion, for sure. And the only other thing that's true is that some of it was filmed in the house.
Yeah.
Everything else. I mean, it's a great ghost story, but it's entirely fabricated.
The rest of it is just Hollywood.
It's just Hollywood. Yeah, it's absolutely Hollywood.
Yeah.
But again, but the Winchester house has to reckon with this because it's part of the cultural narrative that has been put onto this house, and you can't completely fight it. And you also don't want to turn down the money it might bring you, because I can tell you that house with that many rooms, it's a lot of money to upkeep. There aren't orchards self-sustaining it anymore. So that's the story of the Winchester Mystery House. Sorry to be a buzzkill about that haunted house that is not haunted in the way that you think, but it is still haunted. I promise.
No, I enjoy those stories. I like debunking stuff, but then again, like I'm the wet dish rag on everyone's paranormal joy. I'm that.
We try to find the right balance.
Yeah, that's why I like this book. Not saying you have to be a wet dish rag to like that book. That's not the message I'm trying to say anyway.
Fair.
So
I want to visit this place now.
I do
mean,
too.
It sounds really interesting. Just I mean, when you were talking about it, there's a lot of old houses that have weird stairways and stuff for the same reasons you're saying. They remodeled something and just covered up something or put a wall there or whatever because they didn't want it anymore.
To bury the bodies.
Old houses. So many houses have weird aspects to them because of bad remodeling.
Oh yes.
And
you know, yes.
it just kind of seems interesting that she just changed her mind and had so much money. But that was one thing I liked about the book was how you said that society didn't like women, and you mentioned this in the witch chapter too, that they really disliked women of means that like didn't need anyone's help, where they were just, and it sounds like that's how this woman was. Everybody just made up a story about her, but they knew nothing.
Yeah, there wasn't a man to control her.
I'm sorry, that just hit home yesterday. So in front of everyone at Cincinnati, this man kept persistently asking me if I needed help as I was getting my books out of the car. And I said, no. And he's like, do you need help? And I said, no. And he's like, do you need help? I'm like, no. And then finally he's like, are you sure? And I looked at him like, sir, I've told you 4 times I don't need help. I'm putting things into a wagon. And then the amount of cursing out of his mouth for me saying no to him was, it drew people out of, it drew people out of Cincinnati and to just to go break it up because he was angry I told him no.
And just some stranger on the street.
It was just a rando on the street.
Men don't like being told no.
No, by a woman.
It just is, and I don't. There really needs to be a shift in these expectations because I just boundaries, people, boundaries. Come on. If some, it just, I think that there's definitely pushback that we're, all fielding and feeling. And there's certainly been some pushback on this book for its feminist agenda. And Andrea and I were like, oh boy, we could have gone so much harder. Like, oh, you think this is bad? Like, you should hear us talk outside of the book. Like,
well, because it's written by women, it's about women, and what happens to women because of men.
I mean, I'm sorry. Like, I'm so sorry that just telling you history is a feminist agenda.
Right.
I'm sorry that's
the argument that they're having about telling the truth about slavery and telling the truth about all these historical institutions. It's that somehow you're tainting it by actually explaining what really happened, and it's totally ridiculous.
Yeah, it's.
Can we become a world of Amazons, please?
There we go.
Not the company.
No, not the company.
No, I know
warrior women.
Yeah. You meant
the warrior women.
The warrior women. Yeah, it's. Yeah, and the thing that also struck me about the Winchester story is she was dogged by the spiritualist movement, and then it seems with later in life after she died with the house, the sideshow attraction vaudevillian movement of the late 20s and 30s. So she saw so much happen, and those events really colored how people looked at her.
Completely.
But kudos to her for not giving it.
She didn't care.
She didn't care.
She didn't have to.
Yeah.
And
she could purchase the United States at one point, I am sure.
Well, and perhaps because she had so much money and had such loyal people with her, that's why she was untouchable.
Yeah. Right.
Like if her staff was unhappy, then like people would, but since they were happy, that gave her insulation.
They took care of her.
It's true. And that there was a very, very loving relationship between, the people in her life and also too, and you can see it. One of the things that deeply moved me was moving through the staff quarters. A lot of the things that she did in expansions to the house were actually to make the staff quarters and the places that they worked more comfortable. There's beautiful inlaid flooring, beautiful like parquet flooring, and little finials and little aspects of decoration in the staff quarters. No other historic house that I have ever been into has those kinds of details and flourishes and decorations in the staff quarters. They're all very sparse. Money was clearly not spent there. In this case, she really wanted them to feel that they were in a place of comfort and beauty. And I think that that's really incredible. She had she had wash tubs for the staff that had plumbing that was like, there was an aspect of it that was state of the art in that there was washboards that were put into the sinks themselves so that, the cleaners wouldn't actually be having to rub their knuckles raw on actual washboards. It was part of the sink itself. And that was like one of the first tubs to have like done that. And, the fact that they had hot and cold taps so that no one had to go out and get water. It was right to them on the upper floors. That is, I mean, it was a small thing, but like it cut down on so much of the backbreaking part of the labor. And that was something that the tour guides really emphasized of like, look at these little things that we wouldn't necessarily think twice about now because we're so accustomed to washing machines now. We don't have a sense of how this was actually a courtesy, and a great expense. So that to me was just a stunning thing. I took so many pictures of the staff quarters to really just drive that home for me that she wanted their place and their areas to feel decorated and
she treated them like human beings
and definitely like family. They all considered themselves family.
Yeah.
Well, we're heading up to 2 hours.
Yes.
So we probably should wrap it up. We could probably talk for 6 hours if we
wanted. Sarah Winchester is my longest chapter, so I suppose that's. I suppose I was game for that, right?
But for social media, where can people purchase the book? Where can they follow you? I know you're on Twitter because you liked one of my tweets recently.
I love Twitter. That's my for all social media. I'm on Twitter at Leanna Renee, Leanna Renee. That's where I am most of the time. I am on Instagram. I did start a TikTok because I was
Ooh.
told to by
Oh.
my publisher.
Yes.
So, and I'm terrible at it, but I'm doing it though, so I'm there. But I am an old, and it is not, and it is
We
new.
get it.
And
We're here
so
for you.
I don't know. So if you enjoy terrible editing cuts, you will love my TikTok. So but I do want to get, one of the things I want to be doing is like just doing little TikToks of me running away from Gothic mansions.
That's awesome.
That's my goal. I have one up, but I need to just find more Gothic mansions and have somebody just video me running away from
Just
them.
go to Newport, Rhode Island.
See, there we go. Just
You can't throw a stone without hitting one of those.
It's true. It's totally. So yeah. So I want to be just doing my little women running from houses, Gothic novel nonsense. Considering that that's my favorite kind of fiction. So
please in historical gear.
Oh, of course. I mean,
okay.
Yeah.
I have to be in a long black gown, otherwise no one would recognize me.
I do follow a woman on Instagram and TikTok that runs around the Palace of Versailles in Rococo fashion.
That's awesome.
So I can totally see you.
I love her
doing
already.
this.
And no one stops her. She's just there.
I think she has the permission of the museum to do it.
That's fantastic.
But and do it in American Gothic fashion.
That's that's so those are my social medias. As far as the book is concerned, it is available wherever books are sold. So this Kensington is the publisher, so you can go to the website Kensington Books, or again order it into your local bookstore.
It's on Audible.
It's on Audible. Yeah. So we have an audiobook, we have a digital book, so it's available through any digital vendor and also in trade paperback. Request it at your local library. Libraries buy books, and libraries are a huge supporter of authors. So, never feel bad about going and getting a book from the library. It still registers as actual sales for us. So also to support your local independent bookstore. If you go to indiebound.org and you plug in your zip code, that will pull up the local independent bookstores near you, and you can order it in. You can buy local, support local, and also it helps us too. So all of the above. And for those watching from our hometown, collective hometown, I will see you all at Books by the Bank on November 19th. So I'm so excited to be there. And I will, I'll put little heart eyes over Ma Green's chapter.
Yeah.
And I have a question. How often are the tours? Are they all year round?
They are. Obviously, October and fall in general is the busy season. So go to boroughsofthedead.com for information about New York City ghost tours. But we also sign up for the mailing list because we do periodically do virtual tours that can be accessed from anywhere in the world. So we definitely do have people who follow us from all over. And so we do have lots of access to book talks that we're doing that are virtual. So, and we're also going to be trying to do some stuff through the winter months that are some of our tours in a virtual setting. So definitely check out boroughsofthedead.com. And the only time we take off pretty much off entirely is like January through mid-March. Because no one wants to walk around New York City in February.
Very cold.
It is, yeah. So it is just, and treacherous sometimes. So, but yeah, it's a great company. And if I am not there leading a tour, do not worry. My fellow guides are some of the best in the business. So I'm not really doing many tours this season because I am doing this book. So Haunted History of the Invisible Woman. So this is the tour I'm giving, the tour of this book.
Yes.
So yeah,
it's a very good tour.
Thank you.
Well, on that note,
this time, you thank you so much for you taking this much time with me. I'm honored.
Yes, it's been wonderful.
So interesting.
Yeah.
Yes, we can have you on again and talk more.
I know. We would love to have you on again.
Well, let me bring my co-author.
Yes, that would be fantastic. Maybe
can pick her brain about Lizzie
when
Borden.
We're not going anywhere. We're all home.
Lizzie Borden's another one. I wonder if she's glorified.
Oh, she's in the book, and boy, is she glorified
in the book, and it is a complex. I mean, I knew right away, like like Andrea knew that Sarah Winchester was mine, and I knew Lizzie Borden was hers, because we each had our pet projects.
Yeah.
And I was very impressed by Andrea's chapter on her, because it explores all the complexities of it, and does not answer the question of whether she did or didn't do it, because no one can officially really answer that. That's the thing, which is wild, which is why people are so obsessed with it.
Right. Yes, that's why it's an evergreen true crime.
Truly.
Yes.
Truly.
And it's just assumed that she did.
Well, I will say the book throws a lot of wrenches into that statement.
Okay.
So, yes. But
so now you have to
that's for next time.
I will get it.
That's for next time.
Yeah, we'll let Andrea actually talk about her own chapter. So I'll introduce all y'all so she can come and talk about Lizzie.
Yes.
Awesome.
So for
On
tonight,
that note, yes,
on that note, thank you everyone for joining us for season 4 opener of the Cincinnati Cabinet of Curiosities presents the Hometown Haunts podcast. I am your host, Kat Cloco, and with me is Christina Wald and Jen Kohler. You can follow us at Sin Cabinet Curio on Twitter and at Cincy Cabinet of Curiosities on Instagram. And please, like I said earlier, we are dying to hear from you. Please send us your paranormal and fringe history from your neck of the woods to our email, hometownhauntedmail@gmail.com. Everyone, good night and stay spooky. Bye-bye.
bye.
Thanks, everyone.